Good evening, everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives, and tonight is going to be an interesting night. We're going to be talking about the NEED Act that you've seen many of the Green Party come through and talk about in the middle of our broadcasts and so forth. And Joe Firestone is going to break it down and show where MMTers can agree, where they can find areas of agreement, and areas where perhaps it's founded in something that maybe isn't necessarily the truth. We're going to focus on public purpose, and we're going to tie in where the NEED Act addresses public purpose and where we have departures. So this is going to be a nice way of melding several worlds together. Mind you, I have my own opinions on some of these things, but Joe has done the research. He's dug in deep. And I want to let Joe explain this thing. So, Joe, let's go ahead and bring you on, sir. Welcome, sir.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
So all right. So we've got these green folks that come in here and they talk about how we can't do anything. We can't do any health care. We can't do anything until we green the dollar, until we democratize the dollar, because we don't have sovereign currency today. But if we implement the NEED Act, we'll have sovereign currency. This is what they say. In my opinion, it's once again yet another one of those areas where they take myth and lore and they meld it with some really good ideas. And now all of a sudden we've got this thing that's half lore, half moralization, and then a very, very small part based in economic truth, whereas most of their economics are lacking here. But you've been able to do the due diligence of digging through this act and coming up with how it matches up with some of the really positive things that we'd like to see in a reformation of the banking system. So without further ado, sir, let you go on, man. How are you?
I'm fine, Steve. How are you?
Great.
Okay, let me start off then, by saying that what I don't want to do is to focus very much on the crazy reasons why people might have got behind the NEED Act, why they might be supporting the NEED Act. Now, those reasons are important, but they're not important from the standpoint of analyzing the legislation itself and what it would actually do. And from evaluating whether what it would actually do is so different from what MMT-based legislation would actually do. Now, in a talk we just had offline, Steve indicated that you can't arrive at a solution without actually knowing what the problem is. I don't completely agree with that. You can have a glimmering of the problem, a distorted view of the problem, and with some luck, you can devise a solution which works for the real problem, in spite of the distorted view that you entered the situation with. I mean, I've seen that happen a lot of times, in real life. There are some people who are just lucky in what, they decide to do. And so the question you have to ask is, well, what is it that they really are asking us to do? So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, I want to review again the methods used to add reserves to the Treasury general account, the spending account of the Treasury. I've talked about this a number of times, but I want to remind you of it. One thing we can all agree upon is that Treasury must have reserves in the TGA to spend. Those reserves must be produced in there by the Fed marking up the Treasury accounts. And the Fed has certain rules it must follow before it can mark up the Treasury accounts. when taxes are paid to Treasury, then the Fed has to credit equivalent amounts. What it has to do is mark down the accounts in banks that lead to the taxpayers, and it has to mark up the Treasury tax obtained loan accounts. And once that is done, and once the Treasury says that it wants its Treasury tax and loan accounts marked down, and its Treasury spending accounts actually marked up, then that creates a situation where money then is credited, where the Treasury General Account is marked up by the Fed. Now, I'm always going to talk about this in terms of marking up and marking down accounts. And the reason why is because the only one marking up and marking down accounts is the Federal Reserve, because they're the only one with the authority to mark up and mark down accounts. Okay? In other words, to destroy money in certain accounts and to create money within the Treasury accounts. Okay. So the second method is when securities are issued by the Treasury and are sold, okay, and also other federal property is sold, then the Fed must credit the amounts involved to Treasury accounts of one kind or another. If securities are involved, then they have to mark down the security accounts, okay, and mark up, again, the Treasury tax and loan accounts. And then eventually there's a marking down of that, and there's a marking up of the Treasury spending account. And then I've also talked in the past about what happens when coins are minted by Treasury, and are presented for deposit in Treasury accounts by the Mint, which is a department of, I should say a bureau, an agency inside of the Treasury Department. Okay. So what it does is it presents the coins for deposit to its own account at the Fed called the Public Enterprise Fund Account. And so the Fed marks up the Mint's account in return for the deposit. And later on, when the Treasury wants the money from the Mint's account transferred to its account, it sweeps the PEF account for the seniorage, for the difference between the costs to mint and transport these coins up to the Fed and the face value of those coins. So these are the three primary ways, okay, of doing it. And I've emphasized in the past that these are just operations. They are mechanics. They don't really do the funding. What does the funding is Congress appropriating the funds. Congress itself talks about how when it appropriates funds, that it is funding what previously it had only authorized. It goes through a two-step sort of process. It authorizes legislation, okay, and it authorizes spending, which means it approves in principle, okay, of the spending, but then it appropriates. And when it appropriates, it sees itself as carrying out its constitutional role of funding the spending which it has authorized. Okay? So the appropriations then fund the spending. Okay? Along with the president signing the appropriation into law. Okay? Only when that appropriation has been signed can Treasury spend the reserves produced by the other operations? One could, for example, mint a $100 trillion coin and take the seigniorage into the Treasury spending account, and you wouldn't be able to spend that nearly $100 trillion unless you had a congressional appropriation that funded the spending. So I want you to keep in mind, that it's always the congressional appropriation that's going to fund the spending. Now, these matters, the different ways in which the Treasury account can be filled, would work the same way under the Need Act as they work now. The same fundamental principles of marking up and marking down would be involved. So that would remain constant. So let's get past that now, and let's go to the purposes of the Need Act. Now let's see what you think of the purposes of the Need Act. They're as follows: to create a monetary authority, actually within the Treasury Department, which shall pursue a monetary policy based on the governing principle that the supply of money in circulation should not become inflationary nor deflationary in and of itself, but will be sufficient to allow goods and services to be traded in a balanced manner. Okay? So that's one purpose. Now here we don't want to be confused by the following. From the perspective of the Need Act of people, and from the perspective of the system that would exist if the monetary authority were legislated and the Need Act, was legislated, the money actually created by the federal government would be very much, a very large proportion of it, would be in the form of net financial assets for the private sector. In the present system, while deficit spending does always produce net financial assets, the normal way this is done is for bonds or securities to be left in the system as the net financial assets, because public debt is sold to get money into the Treasury tax and loan accounts. Okay? But from the viewpoint of the Need Act people, what would be funded, or what would happen once we were living under that particular regime, is that the money produced would be directly created by the federal government and used so the federal government could spend its appropriations, and as such, that money would be net financial assets, if not offset by taxes. Okay? So, second, the monetary authority shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and the credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase the production so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. Now, maximum employment is a weasel word there, or can be a weasel word, but it's later clarified by the Need Act people, the AMI. where in some other place they say full employment. They use the phrase full employment. Now, it's doubtful they mean the same thing as MMTers mean by full employment. In other words, what we mean is that everybody who wants a job can get a job offer at a living wage with good fringe benefits, at a real living wage with good fringe benefits. They don't define full employment in that way. I think they've been doing it more in the commonsensical way that it's, the political system has always looked at it as a very low rate of unemployment, consistent with the idea that there has to be mobility from job to job, and so some people won't be employed during that time. But I think they pretty much do mean, and they say in another place, that they want to create, I'm saying they say in another place in the NEED Act, now, not some other place entirely, that they're about creating a full employment economy as a matter of national economic defense, that they want to provide for public investment in capital infrastructure, that they want to provide for reducing the cost of public investment, and the way that objective comes about, because a lot of public investment is now funded by loans, by bond issues, which state governments and other agencies would float, getting private sector money and then paying interest on it. And of course, what they want to do is reduce the cost of public investment by directly creating the money for the infrastructure. So no interest has to be paid to the private sector. They want to retire the public debt. Now, I think they want to retire the public debt because they view the public debt as somehow a burden. Okay, whereas the MMTers don't think the public debt has to affect, or does affect, the capacity of the government to spend, no matter how high the public debt is. However, we MMTers, when we say that, are talking about it from a financial capacity point of view. We're not speaking about it from a political point of view. Okay, so the way I view the NEET people is, when they say retire public debt, I say, oh good, not because the public debt is a real burden, but I say, oh good, because that's a solution to the political problem of the public debt, which stands in the way of getting progressive legislation, fiscal legislation, actually passed by the federal government. So I think that purpose is a good thing, even though they may be for it for the wrong reasons. So, next, they want to stabilize the Social Security retirement system, and we'll get to how they do that later. It's a very simple way, not far different from the way we would do it. Okay. They want to restore the authority of Congress to create and to regulate money. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by that. From our point of view, we think that Congress still has the authority to create and regulate money, that it never lost that authority, that it's written into the Constitution, and that it can, in fact, that authority by Congress, that Congress still holds, is what would underlie the legitimacy of the NEED Act itself. So we don't think the authority has ever gone away, and they do, but commonsensically we can see what they mean. That Congress seems to be abdicating that authority now, and under the NEED Act, they could not be abdicating it. So they want to modernize and provide stability for the monetary system of the United States. I'm not sure what they mean by modernize exactly, but I think by stability they mean stop any crashes from occurring but down the road. Okay, and certainly that's a purpose. Okay, and that's an objective that we also favor. And they also want to have the NEAT Act because they think it will contribute to other public purposes. And we'll go over some of those later. But they certainly are dimensions of public purpose that the Act agrees with us about also when we look at a public policy from a normative point of view, and from a prescriptive point of view, which is the proper way to look at policy. Okay. So, next. They want to abolish the creation of money or purchasing power by private persons through lending against deposits by means of fractional reserve banking or by any other means. Now, we don't believe in fractional reserve banking. We don't think it exists. Okay? And by the way, they lately, in explaining this act, have agreed with our view that fractional reserve banking does not create a constraint on federal spending. That's not why they're against fractional reserve banking or want to get rid of it. There are other reasons which I'll get into, later. But anyway, they want to abolish essentially money creation by private persons in the normal way that private banks do it today, which is to accept a note from you and to have that loan create a deposit in your account by marking up that account. They want to take the authority of banks to do that away. Okay. So, next, they want to enable the federal government to invest or lend new money into circulation as authorized by Congress. I think they should have said as appropriated by Congress, and to provide means for public investment in capital infrastructure. I wonder if that's a little redundant with some of the other purposes, but I don't think a little redundancy hurts when stating the purposes involved in something. Next, they want to incorporate the Federal Reserve into the executive branch under the U.S. Treasury and to make other provisions for reorganization of the Federal Reserve system. By the other provisions, what they mean is that once they put the Federal Reserve in Treasury, the Board of Governors would be changing very, very much. And I don't know whether the FOMC would be there. And the Bureau of the Federal Reserve would be run by a commissioner and by a deputy commissioner. And not by a Board of Governors. And of course, all this implies that the Federal Reserve would no longer be an independent agency, but would be directly under the Secretary of the Treasury. Okay, and wouldn't be expected to have any independence. So the Federal Reserve, through this, would be democratically accountable in the way that other agencies in the government are democratically accountable, which, of course, the Federal Reserve is not now. But we have to emphasize that it would be a very different Federal Reserve that they have in mind. And I'll get into some of those changes in a little while. Okay, so if the NEAT Act is passed, they want to provide for an orderly transition from the system we have now to the system the NEAT Act envisions. And then, I think this is the final purpose, but I may be mistaken, They want to make other provisions necessary to accomplish the purposes of this act. So, in other words, they've got a vague sort of catch-all clause there at the end of their list of purposes. But I don't see any purposes in here that are directly in conflict with the purposes that most of the MMT writers have in mind when they talk about passing legislation that's based on MMT economics. Okay, now we know, or we accept, that MMT describes itself as a descriptive approach. But along with this descriptive approach, most of the writers inside of MMT also have a prescriptive approach, which I think among us there's fairly wide agreement about what that entails. Okay? Okay, but in any case, I don't know that our prescriptive approach is very different from the prescriptive approach of the NEED Act people. Even though our diagnosis of the problems involved is probably a lot different from their diagnosis of the problems involved. So, here are key provisions of the Act as specified by the AMI people. First, it incorporates the Federal Reserve System into the U.S. Treasury, where all money would be created as money, not by banks, as interest-bearing debt. Now, I don't think that banks create money as interest-bearing debt. I think that when they create deposits in the accounts for people in return for notes, I don't think the deposits themselves are interest-bearing debt. I think the loan, okay, is an interest-bearing debt, and the note is a promise to repay the loan. But I think there's a little bit of semantic confusion of language in there. But all right, I don't think that's a serious thing. We all have our slogans, okay, and that's one of theirs, okay. And anyway, they want the new money directly created by the government to be spent into circulation to promote the general welfare. We would probably say a public purpose, but I think you get the idea. And then they say that a monetary authority monitors the money system to avoid both inflation and deflation. Now, we'll get into the monetary authority in a little while, but that's a new creation of the NEED Act, which we've not seen before in the form of an institution of the government. So, now second, in terms of the key provisions, the Act halts the bank's privilege, they're talking about private banks here, of course, to create money by ending the fractional reserve system in a gentle, okay, and elegant way. At least that's what they say from their point of view. All the past bank credit that was monetized would be converted into U.S. government money. That is the new money that they propose to issue under the NEED Act. Banks would then act as intermediaries, accepting savings deposits and loaning them out to borrowers. They would do what people think they do now. Now, I can't tell you how many times Warren Mosler has advocated for making banking dull again. Making banking routine. basically making banking accept our deposits and loan out to borrowers who need money for a constructive purpose. Okay? He has wanted to make banking dull again for years and years and years. And this is one of the key provisions of this act. Okay? And then they editorialize a bit. The NEAT Act people do. They say, this act nationalizes the money system, not the banking system. And they say further, banking is not a proper function of government, but only government should provide the nation's money supply. Now, I can empathize and have some degree of sympathy for also the very last clause there, that only government should provide the money supply of the nation. But I'm not sure why banking is not a proper function of government. In other words, I don't know why there hasn't been a public option in banking, if you will. I don't think much of the public option in healthcare, okay? But I do think a public option in banking, like a network of state banks, could have very salutary effects on the banking system, including adding to stabilization over time. Now, the AMI people do not like state banks at all. They consider them a distraction to real monetary reform. It doesn't seem to me that MMT people would consider them a distraction. In other words, to us it seems that public banks, as part of a new Federal Reserve system that was based in the Treasury Department, would be a perfectly fine idea in helping to keep all the private banks in line. So, anyway, that is one MMTer's opinion anyway, that there ain't nothing wrong with state banks, and maybe a lot right with them. So, here's a third key provision. The NEAT Act, they say, encourages spending new money into circulation on 21st century eco-friendly infrastructure and energy sources, including the education and healthcare needed for a growing and improving society, starting with the $3 trillion that the civil engineers estimate is needed over the next 5 years. Actually, I think the amount the American Society of Civil Engineers have estimated in the past, and at the time that the NEAT Act was last discussed in conference, which I believe was in 2016, was actually $3.6 trillion. And if you consider what would happen to money over a certain period of time, I think we're probably looking at more like $4.2 trillion being spent over 6 years. So I would tend to differ with them over the amount. Their amounts come to about $440 billion a year, and mine come to roughly $700 billion a year. A considerable difference in the amount of spending there. Okay, so those are their three key provisions. Now they have a number of other provisions that are very important with respect to substantive spending. And we'll get to those a bit later. I think a lot of you will be pleased by some of what they're advocating for, and maybe by all of it. Okay, the American Monetary Institute has a problem with fractional reserve banking. In fact, they have three major problems with fractional reserve banking, which they assume exists. I don't think MMTers agree that fractional reserve banking actually exists. Strangely, the AMI agrees that there's no constraint on the bank loans based on the fractional reserve system before a loan is actually made. So they're not claiming that now. They're recognizing that there's no constraint that exists. But they're against the private banks being able to mark up accounts in return for loans, okay, on other grounds. They call it fractional reserve banking, but that's not what they're really objecting to, I don't think. I think what they're really objecting to is the bank's capability to create money in return for indebtedness. And they have the following three things to say. First, it's immoral, taking from the whole society and gives to a privileged few who have done nothing to deserve it except for manipulating accounts without producing anything useful for life, instead of using government money spent into circulation. It uses bank debt loaned into circulation, concentrating wealth to obscene levels, which must be stopped and reversed. Now, that objection may be one that is shared by a lot of us. I mean, it's the objection which would be offered by an opponent of the rentier system, as, for example, Michael Hudson, who is very, very friendly to MMT, very close to MMT. Anyway, second, the interest on money created as debt is like a ball and chain on the leg of everyone creating value for living, while the Fed turns over its unaudited earnings on initial money creation to the Treasury. The various banks keep the net interest they charge in the fractional reserve system of creating money. And they go on to say that concentrates money in the wrong hands, where it's been used to overcome regulation, as they did by ending the Glass-Steagall regulations in 1999. And this is them saying, they are destroying government. Now, I view this problem, okay, this objection, is one to the impact which they see the ability of banks to create money having in creating profits, excess profits for those banks, which they then turn around and use to harm democracy in the political process. Now, I have great sympathy for that particular problem. I think that having banks in a position where they can get excessive income based on essentially arbitrage has hurt our democracy. Think of the recovery from the crash of 2008, where the price of money to the banks, okay, and the credit card companies was very close to zero. In other words, what it cost them to get reserves they needed to extend credit to us was at that point virtually costless, because the federal government was trying to bail them out. And then they would turn around and charge us huge margins on consumer debt. And debt, of other kinds. They still went right ahead, even though the cost of money had gone down to nearly zero for them. They went right ahead and were charging some credit card holders who had problems in making their payments annual interest as high as 28 to 30% a year. I mean, usurious interest rates running rampant. That certainly hurt our society and our democracy in many, many ways. Third, the AMI says whoever controls the money system controls the direction of society. If it is government, then in a democracy, citizens can influence and decide what to do with it. And it can function under our constitutional system of checks and balances. If it's banks, then only bankers will decide what to do with it, most likely in their own interest. We have seen what that means. So here I would say, with respect to this kind of objection, is there really control of the monetary system by the banks, by Wall Street, by politicians who have been bought? Is there control, quote unquote, or is there influence? I think it's hard for any of us to deny that there's a lot of influence emanating from the financial sector on the actions of the Federal Reserve in regulating the money system, in helping to bail the banks out, in doing various things. I mean, these on a social level and on an interaction level. The financial people in the Treasury, the financial people in the Federal Reserve, the financial people in the banks, they're part of one social system. And they mingle a lot. And there's the revolving door. And there's the sharing of perspectives. All this is going on. Now, I wouldn't say it's control, but it's damn well an awful lot of influence. So this third objection, while it takes it a bit too far by saying control, is probably not too far off the mark. And we have to ask ourselves, is it reversible or not? Well, it's reversible if we still live in a democracy. And in working with our Real Progressives group and with the progressive movement in general, we're expressing our faith that democracy, as much danger as it is now in, is still operative, and that we can affect the political system and also the monetary system. But we always have to ask ourselves the question, does that possibility of influence and power still really exist for us with all the barriers that are put in our way? And we have to be constantly vigilant to fight all the structures that maximize the influence of the financial sector, and that minimize the influences we have over the regulation and management of that sector and the monetary system. That's just a reality, I believe. So, the AMI goes on to say, in practice, the banks have funded ridiculous bubbles on Wall Street or incredible real estate bubbles. But they did not fund the levee repairs around New Orleans or the bridge repairs in Minneapolis or the $3 trillion the engineers tell us is needed to make our infrastructure safe. Well, I think there's a valid point there. So, the AMI people talk about the additional impacts of the NEED Act, or H.R. 2990, introduced originally into the 2011 Congress by Dennis Kucinich, who at that time was probably the most progressive person in Congress, bar none, including Bernie Sanders. They claim the initial impacts are that it would pay off the national debt as it comes due by creating money to pay for bonds coming due, rather than rolling them over with new borrowing. Again, that takes that political issue of debt, public debt, off the table for good. They want to limit interest rates to 8%, including all fees. I say in response to that, well, why 8%? They've said somewhere that, well, the historical average was between, the historical range was between 4%, and 8%. So they're saying, between 4% and 10%. So they're saying, why not, take 8%? It's a little bit on the high side, but given the history, it seems like a reasonable thing. Well, what I say in response to that is, why specify a fixed amount at all? Shouldn't it be calibrated to the base, the federal rate of interest specified by the Federal Reserve in its efforts to control the money supply? And why not arrive at it some percent above the FFR? So then if the FFR should rise, that interest rate also rises a little. If it falls, that's going to fall. Okay? It seems to fix on a fixed rate is a little too rigid, perhaps. They also specify, say they want 50 states to decide where 25% of the new money would go each year through per capita federal grants. Okay, what do they mean by new money? They mean by this deficit spending, because they would only do deficit spending by creating new money. So let's say that we have a GDP of 19 trillion roughly, and we want to have, we want to run a federal deficit because we're probably going to have a current account deficit of 5 to 6%, and we want to leave a lot of room for private sector savings. So we say, well, let's run a federal deficit, of 10%. That's $1.9 trillion. They're saying, let 25% of that new money, or roughly $450 billion of new money per year in that situation, go to the states through per capita federal grants. And with specified areas where the states should be spending, like infrastructure, health, education, unfunded federal mandates, pensions. And they remark about this thing which the NEAT Act would do and say, this is a big deal. There's no way any local actions, such as, let's say, mythical local currencies, can be as powerful in solving local crises. So I say in response to that, why 25%? Shouldn't the percentage that's allocated to states have to do with the economic context? For example, if we're going through a very prosperous time and there's plenty of money through tax collections by the state for it to fund the various things that the states want to fund, why would we then devote 25% of new money to states when there might be hugely expensive national programs that are in need of funding, given the $1.9 trillion of policy space that we would have with a federal deficit of 10%. So, okay. Then they also have on their plate, with the NEAT Act, by the way, this is all in the NEAT Act, they have tax-free dividends. They want to have bailouts for people. And they say, how about $3 trillion to citizens instead of to banks? With 300 million citizens, that's $10,000 to every man, woman, and child. $40,000 to a family of 4. Our depression/recession would be over. And so you have to ask, is this a prescription for the first year of the NEAT Act? Is it over 3 years? Is it something constant? What exactly is the proposal here? And they also emphasized that the Act would provide funding for infrastructure. Now, they have a very broad definition of infrastructure here. It wouldn't only be roads. It wouldn't only be public buildings. It wouldn't only be water structure. The water resources. It would also encompass changes in energy foundations in the economy, climate programs, of various sorts. I believe they mean all those green initiatives we want to take when they talk about infrastructure spending. They would be included in the infrastructure spending. And they say the NEAT Act will do these things without inflation. Well, the NEAT Act doesn't specify things in such great detail that we're able to evaluate whether all the spending it envisions would be able to occur within a certain period of time without actually having demand pull inflation. We would have to know a little bit more about that. And of course, that spending would have to have specific congressional appropriations it would not necessarily be done entirely from the NEAT Act. I think they view the NEAT Act, okay, as an enabler of spending in these various areas, but not as involving congressional appropriations to spend in these areas, okay, as part of the NEAT Act. So, here are some other things which it would achieve. A prohibition on government borrowing after the effective date of the NEAT Act, unless otherwise provided by an act of the Congress passed after such date. No amount of money may be borrowed by the Secretary of the Treasury from any source, and no amount may be borrowed by any federal agency or department, any independent establishment of the executive branch, or any other instrumentality of the United States, other than a national bank, Federal Savings Association, or a federal credit union, from any source other than the Secretary. Okay, so what they're saying is you can't borrow from any source other than the Secretary, and the Secretary can't borrow either. The Secretary and the Treasury Department have to create the necessary money that other people borrow. Okay. So, what they're all about is retiring the instruments of government indebtedness as these amounts become due. Now, the instrumentality for how they're going to manage all this involves establishing a monetary authority for the United States within the Department of the Treasury under the oversight, general oversight of the Secretary of the Treasury. However, they also emphasize the autonomy of the monetary authority and say the Secretary of the Treasury may not intervene in any matter or proceeding before the monetary authority unless specifically provided by law. And they talk about the independence of the monetary authority. They say the Secretary of the Treasury may not delay, prevent, or intervene in the issuance of any regulation or other determination of the monetary authority, including the determination of the amounts of money to be originated, created, and the most efficient method of disbursement of that money consistent with the appropriations of Congress and the statutory objectives of monetary policy as specified in the NEAT Act. So, questions that could be raised there are, why should the monetary authority be autonomous? In what sense should it be independent of the Secretary of the Treasury? In these provisions, there seems a hangover from the early progressive view of government, which envisioned the technical experts somehow shielded from influences of a political nature, who could make decisions in a just way based on expertise. I think our history in recent years has created considerable doubt about whether this is possible. For example, our best examples are the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, there are lots of experts in those departments, and there are lots of experts in many other agencies as well, that are supposed to be beyond politics. But as we've seen, many of them have a pronounced corporate bias and have a bias against the interests of people and against the public purpose. Now, we can, lament that and say we want to clean it out and try as best we can to clean it out. But how can we clean it out if institutions like the Monetary Authority are independent, autonomous, and not subject to democratic accountability? Who would staff the Monetary Authority? And why would they be any more unbiased or objective than the people who staff the CBO, for example, which also claims we are unbiased. We only do things with an eye to the technical aspects, okay, of our jobs. And of course, all the recommendations they come out with seem to be fairly pro austerity and fairly biased corporations and a neoliberal type of ideology. So I don't know if we need that again in the Monetary Authority. Seems to me the AMI here is expressing faith in an old myth, which has been long debunked. So there's supposed to be 9 members to the Monetary Authority, and they're appointed to staggered terms. These terms are for 6 years. They're appointed by the president. One is appointed as the chair. It's required that not more than 4 members come from the same political party. I guess they say 4 members because they don't want a particular political party to have a majority. But one might say, well, why not have no more than 2 members from the same party? So maybe the minority third parties get a chance to have some input into the Monetary Authority. But I guess that's too much to hope for. So, the Monetary Authority shall establish the money supply and monitor the nation's monetary status. I think they mean, they say establish money supply policy. I think that means establish targets for the money supply. Now, you remember in previous broadcasts, we've pointed out that the efforts of Paul Volcker to contain inflation in the late 70s, and early 80s, were based on the idea that he could control the money supply. And he found that whatever he did using the tools of the Federal Reserve, he could not control the money supply. Why was that happening? Because the private banks could create additional money beyond his capacity to control with his tools. Now, the AMI people envision a little different situation. Their situation is that private banks will not be able to create any money, or at least the one they envision, and they say the act, would implement, is that private banks would not be able to create any money. The only agency that would be able to create any money is the Treasury Department. So therefore, the assumption is the Treasury Department could keep its fingers on the money supply and actually control that supply, and that they would be in a position to control both the price of money, the interest rate, and the supply of money at the same time, which of course cannot be done under current law. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind. I don't know whether it's a good thing, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Okay, the monetary authority may also get into other areas if the president assigns them responsibility for other areas. In other words, delegates to them to perform certain other tasks. Okay, or if Congress does. However, the Need Act specifies the governing principle of the monetary policy of the United States and says the monetary authority shall pursue monetary policy based on the governing principle that the supply of money in circulation should not become inflationary nor deflationary in and of itself, but will be sufficient to allow goods and services to move freely in trade in a balanced manner. Well, that's a laudable goal, I'm sure, but that also assumes that the supply of money is the key factor in containing inflation or controlling inflation and making sure that it's set at the right rate. But we've seen before how in the quantity theory of money, not only supply is important, but the velocity or the turnover in money, okay, is also very, very important. Okay. So we need to take into account the full context of money. Controlling the supply of money doesn't give one full control over the quantity. Now, maybe that does get you very far down the road to containing inflation. But it may not be as efficient as we think because of the continuing influence of automatic stabilizers or the competing demands of adjusting to cycles. So I would simply raise a question about that. I mean, I don't think that it will not work. It may work, but I just think there's a question about it. So, the monetary authority shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and the credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production. In other words, commensurate with the potential for growth, so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. So again, there's this issue of are they after maximum employment or full employment? Inquiring minds want to know. Okay, and we'd also like to know what moderate long-term interest rates are. Why not interest rates permanently set at zero or very close to zero? Okay, I guess there have to be enough interest rates, high enough interest rates to keep the private banks in business, because the AMI system envisions that all the banks outside of the Treasury where the Federal Reserve banks will be. All the banks outside of that will be private in character, and presumably will have to make a profit of some sort. Though I suppose a system of nonprofit banks could be set up. So, the pay of the members of the Monetary Authority, just the 9 members, not anybody they employ, but the 9 members shall receive a salary at annual rates equal to the annual rate determined for an associate justice of the Supreme Court. So that gives you an idea of how important the Need Act envisions the 9 people heading up the Monetary Authority are. Their salaries will be the equivalent of justices of the Supreme Court, which is about as high as federal salaries can go. There's a specification that the Monetary Authority may appoint and establish the pay of such employees as it determines it's appropriate to assist them in carrying out the duties imposed under this particular section of the Need Act. It also says that the Secretary shall regulate the money supply in reasonable accordance with targets established by the Monetary Authority. So even though the Treasury is in nominal control of the Monetary Authority, because the Monetary Authority is autonomous, and independent, it can specify supply targets for money, which then would bind the Secretary to within the bounds, of reasonable accordance. And then further, each year the Secretary must report to the Congress any discrepancy between any monetary target and the monetary supply in excess of 0.5% of GDP at the end of each quarter. So that's control on the Secretary by Congress and by the Monetary Authority that he is supposed to provide some oversight on. So you wonder how the power relations are going to work out there, especially given that the Secretary of the Treasury is democratically accountable through the President, whereas a considerable amount is done in relation to the Monetary Authority to make its managers not so accountable to the people. Now, this is significant because of what AMI has said before in its complaints about the fractional reserve system. It has claimed that the fractional reserve banking system but produces lots and lots of money for the banks that help to weaken and undermine our democracy. So here it is, in terms of its constitution of the Monetary Authority, it wants to insulate it from democratic accountability through the Treasury Department and through the President. That seems a bit of an inconsistency to me. So, then there are also some clauses that talk about establishing a bureau of the Federal Reserve and appointing a commissioner and a deputy commissioner for 7-year terms, also staggered, to administer, under the direction of the Secretary, the origination and entry into circulation of U.S. money. So in other words, the Federal Reserve would still be marking up and marking down accounts, would still be creating the money in this particular system under supervision of the secretary, of course, who would be working with the monetary authority to develop targets for money issuance. And of course, they both would have to do this subject to the limitations established by the appropriations bills of the Congress. But things like the money supplied to banks to back up their lending activities. Okay, if you recall, the banks would be lending things like their capital and their savings deposits and things like that out. But they've got to back everything by 100%. So they have to get reserves created by the federal government to hold in the Federal Reserve banks to back up their loans. So they're not really creating money, but money is being created to sit in the Federal Reserve Bank, or credits, okay, are there in the Federal Reserve Bank to back up loans they're making, and they need this backup before the fact, before they're allowed to lend out. Okay. Okay, so I've gone through a lot of this, and I've taken a long time to go through this. I want to emphasize a few more points and then get to some questions. Okay? There has to be a function in the Treasury Department established by the NEED Act to forecast disbursement requirements, both for Treasury spending in relation to appropriations of Congress, and also there have to be disbursement requirements that are fulfilled in anticipation of lending needs, of backing up the lending of the private banking system. And there has to be a sufficient research capability to continuously and effectively assess the impact of disbursements of U.S. money on all aspects of the domestic and international economies. This is all well and good, but the question arises, does that kind of capability really exist in economic modeling today, such that the disbursement requirements could be accurately forecast, and so that the system would not come up short in the money it had made available for the lending requirements of the private banking system? If not, then the private banking system might not be able to fulfill the credit needs of business and the credit needs of consumers. So to emphasize again, the ability of the banks to create money based on notes of the private banks would be ended. And a lot of the verbiage in the law is about how that would be done. It's pretty convincing that with the regulatory aspect of the monetary authority and that of the Federal Reserve, that they probably would be successful in cutting off the creation of money by the private banks. But there are a number of things we do not know about. Okay. What else do I want to mention here? Okay, so I want to make some observations about the AMI system as reflected in the NEAT Act in order to wind this up. Okay. First, we have to note the NEAT Act and the system it creates makes use of monetary sovereignty. The U.S. government would be directly creating money for itself and for the private sector. And that would be the only money created under this particular system. Okay, the currency is non-convertible fiat with a floating exchange rates, no U.S. debts to foreign nations in their currency, or even after a time, any domestic debts of the government either. Even those debts we have now that are not really debt, okay, in any real sense of that term. Okay, so money would be created only by direct issuance of the government, most of it by the Federal Reserve issuing reserves, essentially marking up accounts. Okay, now banks have to lend from savings accounts with equal amounts held in reserve. They could also lend from their capital, okay, if they wanted to. They could also lend from money borrowed from the federal government if they had to. Okay. So the big issue, as I've mentioned earlier, or intimated earlier, is this enough for banks to fill the credit needs of individuals and businesses working through banks? If it turns out that it's not enough in the short run, we could suddenly find ourselves in a recession or suddenly find ourselves in a crash. If the forecasting capability of the monetary authority and the Federal Reserve is not sufficient, then somewhere down the road we could find ourselves, okay, in problems because the credit, okay, is insufficient. It would be very much as today when a crash occurs and all of a sudden credit dries up in the private sector. But in this case, it would be credit coming from the public sector which would be drying up, and because of the rules, there would be no other credit available. So that could cause a recession, which would not have been in the cards otherwise. Yes, it controls financial bubbles and things like that, but it might create some other problems also. So the question is, should we eliminate all creation of money through the acceptance of notes by banks? The AMI says, yes, we should. That is an evil and pernicious system, and there should be no compromise with it. We should not allow a vestige of it even to exist. I am not so sure, but I will say this. It's an empirical question at this point, I think. We cannot necessarily absolutely say they're off base. It could be that Randy, who's doing a much more careful study of this now, okay, than I've been able to do, will be able to come up with hard reasons, okay, and data which show why the money creation capabilities of private banks are necessary within our system, even if you had facilities like those of the NEAT Act in place. But as I say, that's not something that I've been able to determine here, okay, at this point. And it's a question that I raise. It's also a very serious one because when you talk about all the other elements of the NEAT Act, I don't see that MMTers would necessarily disagree with them, okay, or be opposed to them. The real sticking point in how we view the NEAT Act, okay, other than talking about their picture of the monetary system now and their perceptions of problems that we don't think exist. Okay, putting those aside, putting myths aside, which are mentioned by people who are somehow associated with the AMI, but just looking at their legislation and the purposes of their legislation, there's little we have to disagree with. And in previous blogs, okay, in the TV interview, okay, that Randy had a couple of weeks ago on here, and in Bill Mitchell's blogs, the real disquiet they seem to have with the NEAT Act is the fact that it removes the flexibility that comes from the private sector banks being able to create money. And so MMT writers tend to favor regulatory approaches to this problem and approaches to prevent crashes, okay, through other means, to nip them in the bud as they're developing. Actually, regulation that's very, very tight. Okay, I mean, if you ask a Bill Black, he'll show you very, very tightly regulated things to do with the banks that could very well control them without having to remove their capability to create money. So that's, though, probably the most important way in which we would disagree with them about this act, about the provisions of this act, apart from any justifications for it that they might give, or any myths that the proponents of the AMI bill might subscribe to. There are a lot of other questions we don't know about it. How will the Monetary Authority interact with the Federal Reserve Bureau? If the Secretary is responsible for forecasting disbursements, will the Monetary Authority handle those forecasts for the Secretary? Will the Federal Reserve Bureau handle the forecasts? Will some combination handle the forecasts? And then, of course, again, there's the question of the independence of the Monetary Authority and the autonomy of the Monetary Authority. Why should we have that? Also, don't they treat in their pronouncements on state banking the state banks rather cavalierly, just saying with a wave of their hand, oh, they're distractions? There are a lot of people, and a lot of people among the MMTers, who think that right now, right immediately, that the NEAT Act is a distraction. Yes, it may have a lot of good things in it, and it may have things we want to adopt in the longer run. But right now, the financial system can fund a Medicare for All bill. People are dying because we don't have a Medicare for All bill. That system can fund a full employment program with the federal job guarantee. That system can fund a host of other things we want. So the question which has to be raised is, what is the priority of ending the rentier aspects of the current system, which we might all agree are corrupt? What is the priority of ending that versus the priority of passing these other things? It's an issue in a way that's very similar to the taxing issue. Yes, at some point, we would be in favor of taxing excessive profits or taxing the rich or reinstituting the inheritance taxes at some really high level, because those things are anti-democracy things that we have to be opposed of in the long run. But when it comes to actual practical action right now. What's more important? Is it ending those things? Or is it making it absolutely clear to people that the federal government has no solvency problems, and then going ahead and passing the measures that everybody needs to have a better life right now? These two issues are very analogous. Someday it'll be great to get to the taxation. And someday it'll be great to get to something like the NEAT Act, perhaps, also, with the possible exception of the total cutoff of the private sector's ability to create money in return for notes. But is that something we need for this year? The Kucinich bill ties spending for all these other great things that are part of the public purpose to passing the NEAT Act. Should these things be tied to passing the NEAT Act? I don't think so. This may be a distraction, okay, as AMI likes to say about some other things that it's not so hot on. So, why have the monetary authority at all? Why not make it a part of the Bureau of the Federal Reserve? Is it because the AMI wants a cleaner break with the past? Is there something about creating a slightly different Federal Reserve that could handle all the functions of the monetary authority? Also, why is substantive spending legislation part of the NEAT Act? Why isn't it purely a monetary system bill designed to make monetary sovereignty transparent and to end the creation of money by the private sector? Okay, I said I would say something about what the NEAT Act would do for specifics. And I am going to jump to that now, okay, in ending, because those things, okay, are really interesting. First of all, I've mentioned the funding, okay, of infrastructure improvements. Inside the NEAT Act, there's a Title V, which talks about the things that would be funded. Okay. It also talks about interest rate ceilings and the authority of the FDIC, but it talks about the monetary grants to states. I know we're running very long tonight. It talks about an education funding program. Okay, a very liberal one that would make the educational system of the United States the equal, okay, of any in the world. It talks about what would be done about the Social Security trust funds. And it suggests a very simple solution to the trust funds. And that simple solution was that we take the OASDI funds and have the Secretary of the Treasury submit to the Monetary Authority any requests to cover impending deficits in Social Security trust fund accounts. And what would be done is that if the Secretary submits a forecast of a shortfall in that account, then the Monetary Authority would put that into its disbursements, okay, of federal funds. So the Social Security Trust Fund would be topped up just through deficit spending by that was prescribed by the Monetary Authority. Okay, so that's very similar to my own solution to the Social Security problem, which is when Social Security fails to add any money to the trust fund to no longer have a positive balance but have declining balances each year, and my solution was each year mint a platinum coin to cover the shortfall and top up the trust funds. End of story. End of problem. That's very much analogous to what the need people want to do here. Okay. In Title V is where the monetary dividend of $10,000 a person is treated. They say also Congress shall be aware that funding through this act is available for a universal health care plan as may be enacted by Congress. So, in other words, no insolvency problem with respect to that. Funds will be made available through the NEED Act. Same with resolving the mortgage crisis, which was around in 2011 at the time that this act was introduced into the Congress. And finally, there's a provision for interest-free lending to local governmental bodies under the NEED Act. So when state and local governments run short of money for various critical things, they can borrow the money interest-free from the Treasury Department. So those are the various things the NEED Act sets out to do. A lot of the substantive things are clearly within the public purpose. The only problem I clearly see now is removing all possibility of creation of money through accepting notes by the private sector and by state banks, okay, that may be out there. I think that may be a problem. But I can't see why MMT people would be in disagreement with the other parts of the law, okay, except for that aspect of it. That may, in fact, turn out to be the only area where we would see, say, that's inconsistent, okay, with MMT core principles in some way. But all the other things seem to be consistent with it, in spite of the fact that the AMI has arrived there through a number of formulations and through various kinds of thinking that we view as, shall we say, mythical or misplaced anyway. Okay. So I will end on that note. It seems to me to be a pretty good bill which could easily be amended in order to make it a better bill. And that I don't think that activists from the MMT sphere who are part of the progressive movement should have an insurmountable problem in working with the AMI, the people. We may frame the problems differently, and we certainly want to hold on to our views of what the real problems are and what the real facts of the monetary system are. But that should not mean that we necessarily oppose the policies which are implemented in this bill. So, any questions or anything that you'd like to introduce tonight?
No, I think there was a lot of people saying they're going to want to watch this a second time. I'm reading through all the comments and stuff. Good job, Joe. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. We had a tough go with Mr. Butters tonight. My son's quite a little sick baby right now, and it was quite the...
noticed. Yeah,
sorry.
So I noticed.
Sorry.
Have you ever looked into something called the Feingold diet?
No, but I will now.
Okay, if you Google that on the web, when our kids were young, okay, we had some problems where they seemed to be continually subject to viral infections of one kind or another. They're always, coming down with them and always having some difficulty. And we traced it back to diet. At least we thought, okay, it could be diet. And we put them on this Feingold natural foods diet. It was a little bit of a problem, but it wasn't really too bad. We had to make use of natural food cooperatives, okay, that were in the area. We had to go to an organic farmer for the meats, okay, and things like that. But we found that it took care of the problem.
Oh,
And that after a while, our kids just, grew out of the need for a special diet. Didn't take too long.
Well, fingers crossed. I'll definitely take a look at it. He's still on very, very baby food. It's all organic. He hasn't gotten to the point where he's eating the other stuff yet. But in any event, though, I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to thank you for your time, sir, and for your deep due diligence. I'm going to thank everyone for their time. I'm going to go upstairs and hang out with Mr. Butters and make sure we don't have to go to the ER tonight. So with that, have a great night, everybody. Thank you again, Joe. And we will talk.
Thank you, Steve, for sitting with me for so long.
I'm so sorry. I wish I could have done more. It was the craziest thing. So I appreciate everyone's patience with me. With that, have a good night, everybody.
Okay, take care.
Yeah. Good night, Joe.